Big shot, big man, big gambling Sony CFO Hiroki Momoki Tokifoki has stepped up to the plate and made a claim. Here's what he says. He says, look, man, we're lacking the early phase of IP, and that's an issue for us. He's talking games, films, anime. We don't have that much IP we fostered from the start. Them's fighting words for at least a lot of people. Not for me. I think he's absolutely right. I mean, he's talking globally. He's not just talking film or games. He's talking film and TV. Film and TV is a no-brainer. Even when I was working at Sony back then and we would get free passes to all their movies, you know, they never put out anything really blazingly creative. You know, it was always Oscar bait movies or stuff based on other people's properties. That's always been a problem. Obviously, the video game stuff is more contested by journalists who have covered this today, as well as gamers online. They're like, wait a minute, you old knucklehead. What are you talking about? We got the Infamous, we got the SOCOM, we got Killzone, bring back Resistance, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm here to tell you that, in my opinion, the issue that he brings up is a valid one. And I think if you take your nostalgia goggles off, you will see that he has a pretty good point. It's not an unsolvable point, but a lot of people are like, we want another Killzone, we want another SOCOM, we want another Infamous. And I'm just kind of like, nothing's inherently wrong with any of those brands, but they were never big selling massive brands, right? They did fine, but it's not like you saw a bunch of kids running around cosplaying for Halloween as the whatever his name was, Cole, or maybe that was the second one, the dude in Infamous, or Hellgast, or whatever. They just didn't land. And that doesn't mean there's a difference, right? There's, you know, and people say, well, what's so great about Mario? Well, Mario kind of is ushered in, grandfathered in, because he was there from the beginning. And by the time people even thought about brands and whatnot, he was just sort of cemented into the culture. But fundamentally, though, Nintendo understands the graph, the relationship between the strength of the game and the strength of the brand. And I want to show you this, and this is super subjective, I get it, but I want to show you this little chart that I put together real fast. There's brand strength, there's game strength, right? Sony has really gotten into a bit of a pickle, I think, because somewhere along the lines, and maybe it was because it was successful at a time, I don't know, they allowed a lot of their creatives who were making decisions to say, it's almost like we would rather make movies and TV shows. And I don't mean that like, oh, go make a fucking movie, Neil Druckmann. I don't mean that. I mean from a standpoint of they sacrificed brand sexiness, coolness, neatness in exchange for, aren't we serious? Well, sure, of course, Ghost Tsushima could have monsters in it, but that's not what we're telling. We're telling an authentic Japanese samurai story. Similar to, you know, I mean, fine, you can do that, but you end up basically putting yourself in a world where your brand sinks or swims based on the quality of writing. And no matter what you want to tell yourself, with very rare exceptions, the quality of writing of AAA video games is not up to snuff compared to even a pretty decent TV show or streaming show or whatever. It doesn't mean they're bad. They're definitely better than they've ever been, better than I ever wrote. But without sort of the comic booky, fun, brandable, make toys, be badasses by playing this character, that kind of element, no matter how old you are, unless you're just kind of making something rooted in reality like a Grand Theft Auto or a Call of Duty or a Madden, if you're making intellectual property, there's got to be some sexiness to it. There's got to be some summer blockbustery to it. If you look at the far right, none of these have that. These are pretty weak brands at this point. I will say, yes, I'm biased, but I don't think God of War used to be a weak brand. You had the monsters, you had the Greek mythology. It was very focused and simple with what it was. I don't think God of War is a strong brand anymore. I think what Corey had to do to make it successful was smart and brilliant and correct, But I think, as I've said before, they painted themselves into this corner that the end result of Kratos' arc was a pretty dull character, which is what we see in Ragnarok. And Atreus hasn't picked up the slack. Tsushima is one of my favorite games of all time. The game strength is probably their strongest, in my opinion, first-party game in terms of what most people can enjoy. It's we'll get to Bloodborne in a second. But it's a pretty weak intellectual property. It's kind of like Uncharted. They're both similar. It's like, let's make a game that feels like a Kurosawa film. Let's make a game that feels like an Indiana Jones film. It's like, well, you did that. But when you strip away the game part of it, you're left with kind of an also-ran brand that's just sort of, it just sits there. It doesn't have any of its own sauce, any of its own juice. Yes, the movie, let's put it this way. The movie worked because Mark Wahlberg and, more importantly at the time, Tom Holland. And it was a solid film. But that doesn't mean it was a great brand. It just means that, and it may become a great brand because people want to see those two actors together in an action film. But it's not because there was anything inherently brilliant about Uncharted as a brand. If there was, it would have been made years ago. The only reason that movie got made is Tom Holland was riding off Spider-Man, went to Sony and said, I can pretty much make whatever I want. I want to make that. And they were right. It was a good movie for what it was. Ratchet and Clank is a little tougher. It's one of their best games, one of their least selling games. It's a strong brand in any other category except video games, because, at least for Sony video games, right? Because this is not their audience. It just fucking isn't. By the way, when the Switch 2 comes out, Sony should take Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, which is one of the very best 3D platformers ever made, and put it on Switch 2. They're already dipping their toes into the water with Lego Horizon. This is a great brand, and it's a great game, and there's no reason for them not to, given how poorly it does on the PlayStation, comparatively speaking to the other games, not to build this brand by putting it on the system that most kids and families play just by default. Spider-Man works, but they don't own that, right? Bloodborne is up. I'm not going to go through all of these, but Bloodborne is a very strong brand. If you're Sony and you're like, well, we don't have homegrown brands. Yeah, you do. Assuming Sony owns Bloodborne, I think they do. And Returnal. Horror is always huge. It is always making money. Returnal game strength is low, even though it's one of my favorite games of this generation, because it's too fucking hard for most people. Bloodborne is lower over here on the left than Ghost because it's too fucking hard for most people. If Sony really wanted to say, you know what, there's some boost in these brands, and there are. Bloodborne and Returnal, you could be making movies, TV shows, games. Both of those universes are rich, and they are commercial for the PlayStation core as well as just general population. You got to put another Returnal out, put a special edition out, put a director's mode in, let it be the hard one, but put one in that lets people experience the game who are not needing to get good. You want to build an IP this day and age? For the most part, you can't make it get good. Even Elden Ring. Elden Ring, if you were to say, I want to make a movie based on Elden Ring, yeah, the brand name Elden Ring, sure, because the game is off the charts brilliant, my favorite game of all time. But most people don't fucking know what the hell that game's about because it was too hard to spend any time in the world, similar with Bloodborne. Over here you've got some strong brands, but the games haven't been all that great. Sly Cooper is a weird one, because Sony, we'll see what happens with Astrobot. I hope it does well, but Sony historically struggles to sell family-friendly concepts. But I think Sly, not as a game, but I think as a character, is a pretty fucking strong character, stronger than Ratchet. It's not that they don't have intellectual property that they could do something with, but it's not about saying, oh, I remember being a kid and loving Killzone. Make that again. Well, why? Your memory of it as a kid is coloring the fact that ultimately all Killzone is a really cool enemy design. Everything else you see in a million other games, right? Doesn't mean don't make a Killzone. But what Sony seems to be lacking are people who are able to sort of see the brand strength and also the game strength. Like what they really need is they need a bunch of shit way up here. They need good, Nintendo does it well. I don't think Mario is a particularly strong character on its own. It is because of all the stuff we talked about. But, they're able to, people say, well, they don't make new shit. They make new shit all the time. Their games are consistently different. It's the same IP, but they're always trying to look at the new Zelda coming out next week. They're always trying to reinvent the actual essence of what the medium is with that brand. And then that keeps the brand in people's minds because they're good enough brands. But imagine if you have a great brand, which I think Sony at a just pure nuts and bolts intellectual property level Bloodborne and Returnal are stronger brands than Zelda. I don't mean sales-wise. I don't mean nostalgia-wise. I mean, if you were to just sort of never have heard of any of them, and I showed you art from Bloodborne and Returnal, or I pitched you the stories of that versus Zelda, you'd say, well, of course, Zelda comes in third place. But they seem to really struggle to get up here. You've either got the developers down here that are so enamored by wanting to make serious, I want to tell a story, and I don't want to fill it up with all this comic booky nonsense. I want it to be a real thing, you know? Or they have these brilliant IPs over here, but for some reason they've been allowed, especially with Returnal, I don't know how they allowed this to go off the rails and be super unforgiving for most players. They could have had their next big hit and their next big franchise there, and they could have done a lot of shit with it. Horizon is a great potential brand, right? Horizon is like, fuck, caveman versus metallic dinosaurs? What, are you kidding me? But that game, again, this is their fucking ego getting in the way. This game needed to be meat and potatoes. I want combat. I want some exploration, those beautiful graphics. I don't want to fucking sit and listen to Alloy pontificate and people talking about our culture is in danger and where are the children, whatever the fuck they were talking about in those games. It's like too much talky talk, too much trying to be artists. Just shut the fuck up and give me a Michael Bay version playable of Horizon's IP. But again, there's this sense at Sony, and I'm not salty at Sony, back the fuck up, okay? I'm telling you, they have some brilliant brands. But there is just this lack of ability to sit these people down and say, guys, I don't care what you want to do right now. You get to do some of your passion, but you've also got to make commercial products, okay? Ghost of Tsushima. Put some fucking shit in there. No, your average person, as great as that game was, look how far it is on the right. Nobody knows Jin Sakai. And even if they did, he's just kind of a generic dude. Nobody wants that if you're talking about brand building. Give him a shtick. Give him something. Make him, the end of the first act of the first game, suddenly his eye starts glowing red. What the fuck's going on with that? Holy shit, Jin Sakai is actually part demon. I don't fucking know. I'm pulling that out of my butthole. But the point is, you need some juice on this shit. Otherwise, it's so gross to me. All this money, all this effort spent just to kind of, it goes back to when Jim Ryan was talking about, like, well, PlayStation, we're storytellers. Fuck you, no, you're not. You can have stories in your game. That's great. But I don't come to you and give you my ducats for stories. I come to you for experiences. And that includes, yes, stories and great characters and gameplay. And I don't need your people to make Oscar bait games. I need your people to make fucking good fucking games. And they can be Oscar bait inadvertently, but that should never be the goal. Returnal, forget Concord being a failure. Returnal is Sony's biggest failure of this generation. Because this fucking game right here could have been balls to the wall, blockbuster brilliant, with all they needed to do. All they needed to do was add a mode so it wasn't so fucking hard. Man, it's easy. You just got to get good. There's shortcut. Fuck you. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not saying it's not a brilliant game. It's one of my favorite games. Okay? Listen to what I'm saying, though, man. I'm saying to you, Returnal is so interesting and clever and such a wonderful setting for horror movies. And Sony has no horror franchises. You think it ain't Until Dawn. Until Dawn is the weirdest. I mean, I liked it. I enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to the remake. I like Supermassive, but just like with the casting of Frank Stone, give me a fucking slasher. Give me an Alien. Give me something that's got some fucking comic booky geekiness about it on top of the horror. But it's like, Until Dawn, the guy, he's just some guy you're going after you. Returnal, all they needed to do, and they still have a chance, re-release it. Put in a mode. The default mode is an average difficulty video game. Put in the hardcore mode for the platinum and you're off to the fucking races. That game had a lot of potential and they shat the bed with it. It's worse than Concord. Anyway, so I do push back a little bit on Hiroki Totoki Fufuki when he says there are no, we haven't built a lot of brands from the ground up. The seeds for a lot of great brands are there, but they've got to get up here on the chart. of my very scientific chart. Again, it's subjective. I'm a passionate guy. There is no right or wrong. This is what the fun of it is. We debate it. We discuss it. Your chart could look totally different. But what I'm telling you is when you look at this without your nostalgia goggles, and if you said you have 3 years to make decisions to turn Sony's intellectual property deficiency, assuming you agree with this guy, the CFO, around, take your nostalgia goggles off. Really just think about it from a standpoint of what is going to make a great franchise. I think you would agree they got a lot of work to do in that area that they haven't spent a lot of time on, or if they have, it hasn't worked. When Shannon and I started God of War 1, that was the goal. We said we want to make a franchise. It doesn't mean we were thinking 5 games out, but we were going, let's make decisions. I mean, if they were to make God of War from scratch today with the same philosophy they've been applying, this is what it would be. You would have them flying over to Greece. You would have them interviewing historians about the armor plating and the actual sort of plumage of the Grecian helmets and all this shit. And people were, it's so realistic. It's exactly like it was back in the day. Blah, blah, blah. We fucking jumped through hoops. It took us 2 years to find a character that fit in the universe that didn't look like a goddamn extra from a fucking sword and sandals movie. Because we knew that if you played it straight and actually did like an authentic take on what a Greek warrior was at the time, nobody wants that. They want to feel like a badass. I don't understand. Who is driving the train? Do you drive a train? Who, I don't know what you do with it. Who's making sure things don't go off the rails? How about that? I don't know what the conductor, the caboose guy. I don't know about trains, but I know about this. And, they could fix this. Get some shit up here, Sony. Come on now. Show up and play ball, goddammit.